prepared themselves to saint them.
All right. So we see here in the opening of this chapter that there is silence in heaven for a period of a half an hour. And that long of a period of silence might very much suggest a delay in the judgment that we found similar back over in chapter 7 when the angels were told to hold the four winds. So it could be that this silence is something patterned after that, the delaying of God's judgment. Or it could be to provide some added anticipation of what's going to be revealed when this seventh seal is opened. You know, whenever you're in the middle of something and something stops for a period of time, that kind of raises your anxiety somewhat. You kind of begin to wonder, you know, when's it going to start? What's next? So either of those two, it could be that it's just simply a half an hour of delaying of the judgment of God, similar to the holding of the four winds that we studied about, or it could be to provide added anticipation of what this seventh seal and the opening of it is going to be about. So, what we see is that there are seven angels that are prepared to sound their trumpets. That's in the verses that we've read, verse 2 and also verse 6. So, a warning is about to be given. And we see in what we read in verses 3, 4, and 5 that there's another angel at the altar, and it has a golden censer. And what we've read in those three verses is that he was given much incense, and he offered it with the prayers of the saints. So those prayers ascended up before God. And we find that he took the censer and he filled it with fire from the altar, and he cast it into the earth. And the scripture says there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. When you see that latter part of what we just read, the voices, thundering, lightnings, earthquake, these are the things that symbolizes judgment upon the enemy of God's people. And what we see here in these three verses is that the prayers of the saints help to bring about this judgment, the judgment upon their enemies and the ultimate victory that would be obtained over their enemies. So really what we can say about these first 6 verses is that it's somewhat setting the stage for the sounding of this seventh trumpet. So it's in verses 7 through 12 that we see 4 of those 7 trumpets sounded. Someone read us those verses. Verse 7 through 12. Go ahead.
The first angel sounded, and there followed hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and the third part of the trees was burned up, and all green grass was burned up. And the second angel sounded, and as it were a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. And the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died, and the third part of the ships were destroyed. And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star was called Wormwood, and the third part of the waters became wormwood. And many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. And the fourth angel sounded, and the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so that the third part was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise.
All right. So we see that these four trumpets are sounded. And when you think about trumpets, trumpets are mentioned throughout the Old Testament. We find that they were used to call people together. And that we read in Numbers chapter 10. Someone read us the first two verses.
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Make thee two trumpets of silver. Of a whole piece shalt thou make them, that thou mayest use them for the calling of the assembly and for the journey of the camps.
All right, we know this is, of course, is early on in the history of Israel as they've left Egypt and traveling toward Canaan. And what we see here is that the command is given for Moses to make two trumpets. And the purpose for them was for the calling of the assembly and for the journeying of the camps as they moved from place to place. So trumpets are used to call people together. In Ezekiel's day, in chapter 33 and verse 3, someone read us that verse.
When he seeth the sword come upon the land, he bloweth trumpet and warned the people.
All right, so clearly here is a case of where trumpets were being used, and the purpose for them here is to warn the people. And we find that trumpets are found in the Old Testament to serve as an alarm. In Hosea chapter 5, someone read us verse 8.
Blow ye the cornet and reveal and trumpet in Ramah. Cry aloud at Bethhaven after the origin.
All right, so the trumpets were in addition to the crying out, which of course was the sounding of an alarm. And what we find them being used here in Revelation chapter 8 is to warn, just to warn of the coming judgment that God is bringing. Here's something we need to keep in mind. We've already studied the seven seals, and now we're studying the seven trumpets. These seven trumpets are like the seven seals, and they're like the seven bowls of wrath that we'll be studying later in chapter 15 and 16. And they're similar in that they all follow a similar pattern. And the pattern is that it is that the first four, whether it was the seals, whether it's the trumpets, or whether it will be the bowls, are somewhat alike. Then that's followed by two seals, two trumpets, and two bowls. And that's followed by the last one, the seventh one. That was the case with the seals, as we're studying here in chapter 8. That will be the case with these seven trumpets. That will be the one itself that will be singled out at the end. And then in the 15th and 16th chapters, the same thing holds true with the bowl. So they're similar in that respect. The first four seemingly are alike, then that's followed by two, and then that's followed by one, making, of course, a total of seven. Here's one other thing. Though our understanding might differ concerning exactly what these trumpets are signifying, it's obvious that they are pointing to God's judgment on Rome. And that, I think, is, regardless of what we try to make out of each single individual trumpet, the overall picture is that these are depicting God's judgment upon Rome for the vengeance of his people that Rome has persecuted, that Rome has put to death. In other words, God will bring down Rome. And history, secular history, can help us to see that to be the case. So while we're stressing this, no conclusions that are made concerning the explanation of these trumpets is totally free of questions, nor is it totally free of problems. Take, for instance, if we interpret these trumpets literally, and we try to make an application somehow of them to be in reference to a certain place or in reference to a definite period of time in history, that's impossible to do. But it is certain that whatever the symbolical meaning of these trumpets have, it must be in reference to the warnings of God's judgment upon Rome. Because again, that was the purpose served by trumpets, to warn. And the warning is being issued here in the book of Revelations for the benefit of John and for the benefit of those Christians that will receive this letter. Any comments, any questions? All right, going back to verses 7 through 12, we see the first trumpet is sounded. And when it is sounded, plant life is burned up. We see hail and fire mingled with blood were cast upon the earth. And then we read, the third part of trees were burned up, and all of the green grass was burned up. You know, I couldn't help in reading the descriptions of that first trumpet than to help but to think and be reminded of the plagues that God brought upon Egypt during the time of Moses. And I hope that we are familiar with that. But when I read that, I couldn't help but to think about that period of time when God was bringing his people out of captivity, out of the oppression of Egypt and the slavery that they had been under, and the 10 plagues that God used to bring that about. And when the statement is made concerning the third part, whether it's the third part of the trees or the third part of anything, when that statement's the third part, we need to understand that we're not dealing here with total, complete, or final judgment. This is judgment God is bringing upon the nation, which God has done all down through time, through the Old Testament. And now this same God is rendering judgment upon those nations that are oppressing, persecuting his people. So again, we're not talking about total, complete, final judgment when we see the statement made a third, in this case, a third of the trees. So it's most likely that this is referring to some sort of natural calamity. Any questions on the first trumpet? All right, in verse 8 and 9, we have the second trumpet is sounded. And when it is sounded, the creatures in the sea and the ships are destroyed. Notice it says, it was, as it were, a great mountain burning with fire was cast into the sea, and the third part of the sea became blood. Then the third part of the creatures which were in the sea and had life died. And the third part of the ships were destroyed. When you think about ships being destroyed, that would tend to bring to mind that this may have reference to the economic and the commercial collapse. Because again, we're talking about judgment against Rome. So to me, that is reasonable to conclude that here is the sounding of this second trumpet, and this is bringing judgment upon Rome in another area of things that will cause Rome to fall. So again, this is most likely, this second trumpet is referring to some sort of a natural calamity. And then in verses 10 and 11, the third trumpet. When the third trumpet sounds, the waters become wormwood. It says, there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon the third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters. And the name of the star is called wormwood. And the third part of the waters became wormwood, and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. So this is now the sounding of the third trumpet, and we see what it affects. It affects the waters and the rivers and the fountains of waters. It said this star that fell into the waters was called wormwood. Wormwood was a bitter plant that was used in the Old Testament to punish idolaters. We find a reference made to it when God is warning the children of Israel that you disobey me, and here is what you can expect. And that's almost all of what chapter 29 is about. Let's read verse 18, someone.
Lest there should be among you man or woman, or family, or tribe, whose heart turneth away this day before our God, to go and serve gods of these nations, lest there should be among you a root that beareth gall and wormwood. So
here's God warning Israel. He tells them, if you're obedient to me, here's the blessings you will receive. But then God says, if you disobey, here is the curses that will come upon you. And we see gall and wormwood made mention of in Deuteronomy. It's over in Jeremiah, again, talking to Judah during the time of the prophet. Jeremiah 9 and verse 15, someone read.
For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, behold, I will feed them, even this people, with wormwood, and give them water and gall to drink.
All right. So God is speaking to Israel, to his own people again. And we see, he says that if you will, behold, I will feed them, even this people, with wormwood, and give them water of gall to drink. And then going on into Jeremiah, look at chapter 23, and someone read this verse 15.
Therefore thus saith the Lord of hosts concerning the prophets, behold, I will feed them with wormwood, and make them to drink the water of gall, for from the prophets of Jerusalem is pains gone forth into all the land.
All right. So again, we see the use of wormwood in the Old Testament. It truly was a bitter plant, and it was used by God as a form of punishment. So what we're seeing here is in this statement that a third part of the waters became wormwood and many men died of the waters because they were made bitter. What we're seeing is that Rome will experience bitter suffering. Because of what? Because of their rebellion. Because of their rebellion against God that led them to persecute and kill God's people. So again, with this third trumpet, it seems that most likely it too is referring to some sort of a natural calamity. And then verse 12, the fourth trumpet. When it sounded, the sun, the moon, and the stars are darkened. The statement is made there in verse 12, the third part of the sun was smitten, and the third part of the moon, and the third part of the stars, so as the third part of them was darkened, and the day shone not for a third part of it, and the night likewise. So again, it was difficult for me to read that 12th verse and again not think about the plagues that God brought upon Egypt back there during the time of Moses. And we see similar language is used in the Old Testament. Similar language when it comes to the overthrow of Babylon. Someone read us Isaiah 13 and verse 10.
For the stars of heaven and the constellations thereof shall not give their light. The sun shall be darkened in his going forth, and the moon shall not cause her light to shine.
All right. So here is the symbolical words given in reference to the downfall of Babylon. And we see the same language is used in Ezekiel 32 and verse 7 in regards to God's judgment upon Egypt. And again, this is not the Egypt of Moses. This is another Egypt down through time that Israel or Judah tried to make alliances with. So another Egypt, but we see God's judgment. Someone read it, verse 7.
And when I shall put thee out, I will cover the heaven and make the stars thereof dark. I will cover the sun with cloud, and the moon shall not give her light.
So again, similar language describing what? God's judgment. And we see even when it comes to God's judgment on Judah, the nation of Judah, we see that in Joel 2 and verse 10. Someone read that.
The earth shall quake before them, the heavens shall tremble, the sun and the moon shall be dark, the stars shall withdraw their shine.
All right. And not only to Judah, but Joel goes on in chapter 3 and shows that God is like this when it comes to other nations. Someone read this verse 15 of chapter 3.
The sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shine.
All right. So again, the point we've made several times in our study of Revelation, the more familiar that we are with the Old Testament, then the less confusion, the less difficulties that we have as we study the book of Revelation, because it is language that has already been used. And for those that were familiar with the Old Testament, they would certainly have an understanding of what these symbols have reference to. So we have the sounding of these first four trumpets. And most certainly, they're picturing natural calamities that God is using as his agent. God uses nature as his agent. We've seen that all down through history. And so we see here that God is using his agent of nature to bring about his judgment upon Rome, who is the persecutor, who is the enemy of God's people. it's interesting that secular history records that one of the main things that led to the fall of the Roman Empire was a series of natural disasters. That is recorded in almost all history books pertaining to the fall of Rome. But I think that we'll see with the two trumpets that are yet to remain that we'll be studying, and the 7 bowls of wrath that we will be getting to, we'll see that natural calamities are not the only thing that led to the downfall of Rome. It certainly contributed, but it was not the thing that led to the downfall, but it certainly played its part. It certainly had its part. So now we come to verse 13. In verse 13, we have a woe given in reference to these remaining trumpets. Verse 13, we see a triple woe. Notice, woe, woe, woe to the inhabitants of the earth by reason of the other voices of the trumpet of the 3 angels which are yet to sound. So a triple woe is given in verse 13. Triple, well, it's obvious, it's to emphasize the severity of what's still ahead. And the interesting thing here, I thought it would be worthwhile to mention, is that the King James and the New King James uses the word angel, while the American Standard, the English Standard, the New American Standard, and the Revised Standard use the word eagle. And it's interesting if you have a New King James Version, that in the footnote of it also says eagle. So really only the King James uses the word angel here in verse 13 when it says, I beheld and heard an angel flying through the midst of heaven. So when you think of it from the standpoint of an eagle, there's certainly symbolism that is implied in an eagle. An eagle is a symbol of vengeance. And we see that in Deuteronomy 28 and verse 49. Someone read us that verse.
The Lord will bring the nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth, as swift as the eagle flies, a nation whose language will not understand.
All right. So again, we're back to the book of Deuteronomy. And remember, we're talking in Deuteronomy 28 and 29, God is talking about the blessings of obedience and the cursing of disobedience. And so God is warning the nation of Israel, which of course is united at this time. He's warning them, as he said, that I will bring a nation against you from afar, from the end of the earth. And it will be swift as an eagle. Doing what? Bringing vengeance upon you because of your disobedience. So we see eagles are used as a means of vengeance, and Hosea says in chapter 8, someone read it, verse 1.
Set the trumpet to your mouth. He shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and rebelled against my law.
So even in the days of Hosea, long removed from the time of Deuteronomy, we still see God showing his vengeance upon disobedience, even if it's his own people, even if it's those to whom that he has declared to be his own people. God is not tolerating, allowing for disobedience. And so as he says here, set the trumpet to your mouth. In other words, give the warning. And here is the warning. He shall come like an eagle against the house of the Lord, because they have transgressed my covenant and they have rebelled against my law. So in this verse that we're looking at, verse 13, it serves to warn of disaster that's coming. Yes, whatever these first 4 trumpets amount to, whether it be natural calamities or whatever, they are certainly within their own right, something difficult to be dealt with. But the warning is, you've not seen nothing yet. Not till you see what these 3 other trumpets are going to hasten. So woe, woe, woe unto the inhabitants of the earth. So the warning is simply that more, and that the worst is yet to come. Any questions, any comments on chapter 8?
I wonder how many questions people have.
So,
I wonder how many questions Christians have.
yeah,
Find the difference. Angel, and then, the other was Peter.
Yeah.
Why did God do that? God did what he wanted to.
and it was all a matter of avenging the persecutors of his people. And that's the assurance and the comfort that all of this gives to John and to the people of his day and to us even today, if we should fall under persecution in the society that we live in. We have the hope that God is in control. We have more than the hope. We know that God is in control. And we know that if the message of Revelation is remain faithful, regardless, the victory will ultimately be yours.
John went off from this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. You may lose your life, but that's better to lose your life than to lose your faithfulness. So, in review, if you have your papers, in Revelation chapter 8, we see the opening of the 7th seal, and that introduces the 7 trumpets. The sounding of the trumpets is preceded by a dramatic silence in heaven, which emphasizes the significance of what's happening. So John then sees 7 angels who stand before God being given 7 trumpets. So another angel who stands by the golden altar before the throne of God is given much incense in order to do what with? Someone read us verses 3 and 4.
They should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar, which was before the throne.
All right. So he was given much incense in order that he could offer it with the prayers of all of the saints upon the golden altar that was there before the throne. And going back to Revelation chapter 6, in verses 10 and 11, what questions and requests might have been included in these prayers of the saints? Remember? Go back and look at it there in what we see.
They wanted the Lord to take vengeance, why he was taking so long. Take vengeance upon them. One thing, but
So back there, remember, it says, how long, O Lord, holy and true, will you judge and avenge our blood on those that dwell on the earth. So they're asking for vengeance. They're asking for God to take and to have the vengeance. And of course, we know from the New Testament, God is the only one that is supposed to take vengeance, right? Are we as Christians to take vengeance? No. But God can, and God does. And there's one other, what would be the word? One other institution, agency, maybe you know the word I'm looking for. What other agency is also allowed by God to take vengeance? The civil authorities, the laws of the land. He is God's avenger to execute wrath upon them that do evil. All right? So that very well could be what we're seeing here in chapter 8. How long, O Lord, until you judge and avenge our blood on those that dwell on the earth? Because certainly we see that's what's taking place. That's what's unfolding in all of these trumpets that we've studied. So what does the angel do with the fire from the altar? Verse 5. He threw it to the earth, which results from this act. What results from this action? All right. That was when a third of the trees were burned up and all of the green grass was burned up. So may we conclude from this that God is about to answer the prayers of the saints with trouble on the earth. I think most definitely. Because again, that's what these trumpets are warning about. So when the first angel sounded, what was thrown to the earth? Verse 7. All right. And that's what was thrown to the earth. What part of the trees and the grass were burned up? A third. A third of the trees were burned up and all of the green grass was burned up. When the second angel sounded, what was thrown into the sea? Verse 8 and 9. Right? Something like a great mountain burning with fire. What fraction of the sea became blood? A third. A third part of the sea became blood. What happened to a third of the creatures and the ships in the sea? All right. A third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. When the third angel sounded, what was the name of the star that fell on a third of the rivers and the springs in verses 10 and 11? Wormwood. And what happens to the waters as a result of that? Again, a third part of the waters become wormwood. Many men die from the water because it was made bitter, not fit to be able to be drunk. And when the fourth angel sounded, what happened to a third of the sun, the moon, and the stars? Verse 12. Okay. A third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, a third of the stars, so that a third of them were darkened. A third of the day did not shine, and likewise the night. So why does the angel flying through heaven pronounce 3 woes upon the inhabitants of the earth? Verse 13. Why does he do that? Right. Woe, woe, woe. 4 have sounded, and 4 have been bad enough. But woe, woe, woe for the 3 that are yet to be sounded. Okay, time is up. And as I've said, the questions for chapter 9 are in the folder or the plastic tray on the foyer in the back behind the door. Any comments, any questions?
That wormwood, I've heard about it somewhere before, see it, some foreign country.
Only other thing I can ever, it would be those passages in the Old Testament. I'm not sure of any present day happening where wormwood would even still be, but certainly in the Old Testament. And that may be what our memories are reminding us of. You want me to leave the podium? Or, okay.